The story of the wise men visiting the infant Jesus is one of the most beloved and most frequently depicted scenes in all of Christian tradition, appearing on countless Christmas cards, in innumerable nativity scenes displayed in churches and homes around the world during the holiday season, in children's pageants, where young performers don elaborate costumes to represent these mysterious visitors from the East, and in the collective imagination of billions of people who have grown up with this story as central element of the Christmas narrative that they heard repeated year after year, until its details became so familiar that they seemed as certain and as fixed as any fact could be. 3 kings on camels, wearing crowns and sumptuous robes, following a miraculous star that led them across vast deserts to a humble stable in Bethlehem, where they found the newborn Jesus lying in a manger surrounded by shepherds and animals, where they knelt before him and presented their gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh, before departing to return to their distant kingdoms. Warned in a dream not to report back to the jealous King Herod, who had asked them to bring him word of where the child could be found so that he too could go and worship, though his true intention was murder rather than worship, destruction of a potential rival rather than adoration of the promised Messiah. This is the story as most people know it. The story as countless artistic representations have depicted it. The story as it lives in the popular imagination, shaped by centuries of tradition that have added details, filled in gaps, and created a narrative far more elaborate and far more specific than anything the biblical text actually provides. But what does the biblical text actually say? What do the original sources tell us about these mysterious visitors, and how does that original account compare with the elaborate tradition that has grown up around it over 2 millennia of Christian devotion and imagination? The answers to these questions are surprising, even shocking, to many people who have never examined the biblical text carefully, and who have simply assumed that the familiar details of the traditional story must be in the Bible somewhere, because they have heard them repeated so often and in so many contexts that question their accuracy. Before we examine what the text actually says and what it does not say, before we strip away the layers of tradition to reveal the factual core of this story that is both simpler and more mysterious than the traditional version, I need you to do 3 things that will prepare you to receive information that may challenge assumptions you have held since childhood, and that may transform how you understand not only this particular story, but the entire process by which biblical narratives have been embellished, elaborated, and transformed over centuries of transmission and interpretation. First, subscribe to this channel immediately, because this examination of the wise men's story is part of a larger project of recovering the factual content of biblical narratives from the traditional accretions that have obscured that content and that continue to be transmitted as if they were biblical truth, when they are actually post-biblical additions that may or may not be accurate, but that certainly cannot claim the authority of the original inspired text. Second, like this video to join a community of seekers who value truth over tradition and who are willing to have their assumptions challenged when those assumptions turn out to be based on sources other than the biblical text they thought they were based on. Third, write in the comments, "I seek the truth," to declare your commitment to understanding what the Bible actually says rather than what tradition has taught you. It says, a commitment that will serve you well not only in understanding this particular story, but in approaching all biblical texts with the critical attention they deserve and rarely receive from readers who assume they already know what the texts say because they have heard traditional interpretations repeated so often that those interpretations have become indistinguishable in their minds from the text themselves. The account of the wise men appears in only one of the four canonical Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, in the second chapter of that Gospel, comprising approximately 12 verses that constitute the entirety of the biblical information we possess about these mysterious figures and their visit to the young Jesus. This is the first surprise for many readers who assume that a story so important and so familiar must be well attested across multiple sources, must be described in detail by several of the Gospel writers, must have left extensive traces in the earliest Christian documents. But no, the wise men appear only in Matthew, not in Mark, which is generally considered the earliest Gospel and which contains no birth narrative at all, not in Luke, which contains an extensive birth narrative including the Annunciation to Mary, the journey to Bethlehem, the birth in the manger, and the visit of the shepherds, but which makes no mention whatsoever of any visitors from the east bearing gifts, and not in John, which begins with a theological prologue about the eternal Word becoming flesh, but which provides no narrative details about the circumstances of Jesus' birth or infancy. The wise men's story is entirely dependent on Matthew's account, and anything we want to know about them must be derived from what Matthew tells us, or honestly acknowledged as inference, speculation, or tradition that goes beyond what Matthew provides. This is not to say that Matthew's account is unreliable or that the visit of the wise men did not happen as Matthew describes it, but it is to recognize that our information is limited to one source and that we should be careful not to claim knowledge that our single source does not actually provide. However much we might wish for more details about figures who have captured the imagination of countless generations of Christian believers and whose story seems to cry out for the elaboration it has received, even if that elaboration cannot claim biblical authority, what does Matthew actually tell us about these visitors? The Greek text calls them magoi, a word that has been translated variously as wise men, magi, and sometimes kings, though this last translation is interpretive rather than literal and reflects later tradition rather than anything in the text itself. The word magoi originally referred to a Persian priestly caste associated with Zoroastrianism, specialists in religious rituals, dream interpretation, and what we would today call astrology, the study of celestial phenomena as indicators of earthly events and divine communications. By the time of Jesus, the term had broadened to include various types of practitioners of esoteric knowledge from the eastern regions of the ancient world, people who studied the stars, interpreted dreams, practiced divination, and claimed access to hidden wisdom that ordinary people did not possess. These were not kings in any political sense, not rulers of nations wearing crowns and commanding armies, but scholars and priests of a sort, religious specialists whose expertise lay in reading the signs that heaven displayed to those with eyes to see and knowledge to interpret what they saw. The traditional image of three crowned kings riding camels across the desert is entirely absent from Matthew's text, which says nothing about how many visitors there were, says nothing about their mode of transportation, says nothing about crowns or royal status, and provides no names for these anonymous figures who appear suddenly in the narrative, play their role in the story, and disappear equally suddenly without any further information about who they were, where exactly they came from, or what became of them after they returned to their homeland by a different route to avoid Herod's murderous intentions. The number 3, so firmly fixed in traditional representations that we speak of the 3 kings or the 3 wise men, as if their number were established fact, derives entirely from the number of gifts mentioned in Matthew's account: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The text says nothing about how many magoi there were, and early Christian tradition actually varied considerably on this point, with some sources suggesting 2 visitors, others suggesting 4, others suggesting as many as 12. before the Western Church eventually settled on 3 as the standard number, based on the assumption that each visitor brought one gift, an assumption that the text does not require, and that could easily be wrong if, for example, the gifts represented a collective offering from a larger group rather than individual presentations by 3 specific people. The Eastern Christian tradition has often maintained that there were 12 magoi rather than 3, and this tradition has as much claim to accuracy as the Western tradition of 3, which is to say that neither tradition can claim biblical support, because the Bible simply does not provide this information, and any number we assign to these visitors is inference or tradition rather than established fact derived from the text itself. The names traditionally assigned to the 3 kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, appear nowhere in the Bible and are not attested in any source until centuries after the events described, emerging from legendary traditions that filled in the gaps left by Matthew's sparse account with details that satisfied the curiosity of believers who wanted to know more about these mysterious figures than the canonical text was willing to tell them. The question of when the magoi arrived and what they found when they arrived is another area where traditional representations diverge dramatically from what Matthew's text actually describes, creating a composite image that conflates elements from Matthew's account with elements from Luke's account in ways that neither gospel supports and that would have puzzled the original authors who told their respective stories without any apparent knowledge of or reference to what the other author was writing. The traditional nativity scene brings together the shepherds from Luke's gospel and the wise men from Matthew's gospel, positioning them together around the manger where the newborn Jesus lies, suggesting that these visits occurred simultaneously, or at least in close proximity on the night of Jesus' birth, or very shortly thereafter. But Matthew's account suggests something quite different. Matthew does not mention a manger at all, does not describe Jesus as newborn, does not place the scene in a stable or any other location associated with the immediate circumstances of birth. Instead, Matthew says that the magoi came to the house, where they found the child, with Mary his mother, using language that suggests a settled domestic situation rather than the emergency accommodations of a crowded inn that Luke describes. The Greek word Matthew uses for Jesus is paidion, which can refer to a young child rather than specifically a newborn infant, and the reference to a house rather than a stable or manger suggests that by the time the magoi arrived, Joseph and Mary had established more permanent lodging in Bethlehem than the temporary arrangements Luke describes for the night of Jesus' birth. The time indicators Matthew provides reinforce this impression that the Magoi's visit occurred considerably later than the night of Jesus' birth. When Herod realizes that the Magoi have departed without reporting back to him as he had requested, he orders the massacre of all male children in Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, calculating the time according to the time which he had determined from the Magoi. This suggests that Herod's conversation with the Magoi had established that the star first appeared up to 2 years before his conversation with them, which would mean that Jesus could have been as much as 2 years old by the time the Magoi arrived, if the star's first appearance coincided with his birth. Now, Herod was being thorough and perhaps paranoid in his calculation, wanting to make sure he eliminated any potential rival by casting a wide net that would catch the target even if his estimates were imprecise. So we cannot conclude with certainty that Jesus was actually 2 years old when the Magoi arrived. But we can conclude that Matthew's narrative does not suggest a newborn infant in a manger visited by Magoi on the same night that shepherds arrived, and that the traditional conflation of Matthew's and Luke's accounts into a single composite scene has created an image that neither gospel actually presents, and that obscures the distinctive elements of each gospel's account of Jesus' early life. The Magi found a young child in a house, not a newborn in a manger, and the traditional nativity scene that places them at the Manger alongside the shepherds is artistic and devotional construction rather than accurate representation of what either gospel describes. The star that guided the Magi has been the subject of endless speculation and investigation, with astronomers and historians attempting to identify what celestial phenomenon might have been visible in the relevant time period and might have been interpreted by Eastern astrologers as signifying the birth of a king in Judea. Various candidates have been proposed: a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation Pisces in 7 BCE, which would have had astrological significance, suggesting a major royal birth in the region associated with Pisces in ancient astrological geography, a nova or supernova recorded by Chinese astronomers around 5 BCE, a comet that might have appeared around the same time, or some combination of phenomena that together created an unusual celestial display that caught the attention of professional sky watchers who made their living interpreting such displays for clients who wanted to know what heaven was communicating through the language of celestial events. These investigations are interesting and may provide genuine historical insight into what the Magi actually observed, but they face a fundamental problem in that Matthew's description of the star's behavior does not correspond to the behavior of any known astronomical phenomenon. Matthew says the star went before them and stood over the specific location where the child was, language that suggests directed movement and precise positioning that no natural celestial object could accomplish, since stars and planets and comets move across the sky in ways determined by orbital mechanics, rather than by any intention to guide travelers to specific destinations. Either Matthew is using phenomenological language that describes how the star appeared to the Magi without making claims about its actual physical behavior, or Matthew is describing a miraculous phenomenon that transcended normal astronomical behavior and that cannot be identified with any natural celestial event, regardless of how unusual that event might have been. The gifts the Magi brought have been interpreted symbolically since earliest Christian reflection on this passage, with gold representing kingship and Jesus' royal identity as Messiah descended from David, frankincense representing divinity and Jesus' identity as Son of God worthy of worship, and myrrh representing mortality and the death that Jesus would eventually suffer for the redemption of humanity, its use in burial preparation foreshadowing the crucifixion from the very beginning of Jesus' life. These symbolic interpretations are meaningful and have enriched Christian devotion and theological reflection for centuries, but we should recognize that they are interpretations rather than facts about what the Magi intended by their gifts or what the gifts meant in the original context of the visit. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh were all valuable trade goods from the East, luxury items appropriate as gifts for royalty without necessarily carrying the specific symbolic meanings that later Christian interpretation has assigned to them. The Magi may have brought these gifts simply because they were the finest things they had to offer, the kind of gifts one brings when visiting a king, without any intention to communicate theological truths about the recipient's nature and destiny. The symbolic interpretation is not wrong necessarily, but it is interpretation that we bring to the text rather than meaning that the text explicitly provides, and honest engagement with the text requires acknowledging this distinction, even when the interpretations are beautiful and spiritually enriching and have been part of Christian tradition for so long that they feel like facts rather than interpretations. The warning the Magi received in a dream not to return to Herod connects this story to the broader theme of dreams as vehicles of divine communication that runs through Matthew's infancy narrative. with Joseph also receiving multiple dream warnings that guide his actions in protecting the child from danger. This theme may reflect the Magoi's professional association with dream interpretation as one of their areas of expertise, suggesting that God communicated with them through a medium they were trained to attend to and interpret, meeting them where they were rather than requiring them to adopt unfamiliar modes of receiving divine guidance. The departure of the Magoi by another route triggers Herod's murderous rage and the massacre of the innocents that follows, an event that has been questioned by historians who note the absence of any corroborating evidence for such a massacre in other sources, including Josephus, who documented Herod's many crimes in considerable detail, but who makes no mention of any slaughter of infants in Bethlehem. Defenders of the account's historicity note that Bethlehem was a small village where the number of male children under 2 years old would have been relatively small, perhaps a dozen or two, not enough to register as significant atrocity in a reign marked by much larger-scale murders, including Herod's execution of several of his own sons, whom he suspected of plotting against him. The massacre of a few peasant children in an obscure village might not have seemed noteworthy enough to record by historians focused on the major political events of Herod's reign, even if it occurred exactly as Matthew describes. Whether the massacre is historical fact or theological construction, designed to present Jesus as a new Moses who escapes the murderous designs of a wicked king, just as Moses escaped Pharaoh's attempt to kill the Hebrew infant boys, the narrative serves Matthew's purposes of establishing Jesus' identity and significance from the very beginning of his life, through events that parallel and fulfill Old Testament patterns and prophecies. The development of traditions about the Magoi beyond what Matthew's Gospel provides is a fascinating study in how religious imagination works to fill gaps left by sacred texts, creating elaborate narratives that satisfy the human desire for detail and specificity that the original sources deliberately or accidentally omit. Within a few centuries of Matthew's composition, the anonymous Magoi of the Gospel had acquired names, nationalities, physical descriptions, detailed backstories, and elaborate legends about their subsequent lives and deaths that transformed them from mysterious figures who appear briefly and disappear into fully developed characters, with biographies as detailed as those of any historical figure from the ancient world. The names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, which are now so universally associated with the wise men that many people assume they must be biblical, first appear in Western sources around the 6th century CE, more than 500 years after the events they supposedly describe, and different traditions assign different characteristics to each name in ways that reveal the creative rather than historical nature of these attributions. In the most common Western tradition, Melchior is depicted as an elderly man with white hair and beard representing Europe, Caspar as a middle-aged man representing Asia, and Balthasar as a young man with dark skin representing Africa, a configuration that transforms the Magoi into representatives of the 3 continents known to the medieval world, and that universalizes their homage to Jesus as recognition from all of humanity rather than merely from one particular region or people. The transformation of the Magoi from Persian religious specialists into kings appears to have been influenced by Old Testament passages that were read as prophecies of Gentile rulers bringing tribute to the Messiah, particularly Psalm 72, which speaks of kings of Tarshish and distant shores bringing tribute, kings of Sheba and Seba presenting gifts, and Isaiah 60, which describes nations coming to Israel's light, and kings to the brightness of her dawn, with the wealth of nations being brought, including gold and frankincense, and processions of camels from Midian and Sheba. These passages, read as messianic prophecies, and seen as fulfilled in the visit of the Magoi, gradually shaped how the Magi themselves were understood and depicted, transforming them from the scholarly priestly class that the Greek word magoi actually denotes into the royal figures that the prophetic passages seem to predict. The camels that feature so prominently in traditional representations of the wise men's journey derive from Isaiah 60's reference to processions of camels, rather than from anything in Matthew's account, which says nothing about how the Magi traveled and which, given the likelihood that they came from Persia or Babylon, might equally well have imagined them traveling on horses, which were the preferred mounts of Persian nobility, or in wheeled vehicles, or by some combination of transportation methods appropriate to a long journey across varied terrain. The camel became associated with the wise men because the prophetic passages that were read as predictions of their coming mentioned camels, and because the camel served as convenient visual symbol of exotic Eastern origin that communicated immediately to viewers that these figures came from far away, from lands beyond the horizon, where strange animals carried travelers across landscapes very different from the familiar landscapes of the Mediterranean world, where Christianity developed and where most Christian art was produced. The relics of the three kings, their purported remains preserved and venerated as sacred objects that connected the faithful to these holy figures who were among the first to recognize and worship the Christ child, became important cult objects in medieval Christianity and remain objects of veneration today. According to tradition, the Empress Helena, mother of Constantine, discovered the remains of the three kings during her famous pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the 4th century. The same journey during which she supposedly discovered the true cross and other relics associated with Jesus' life and death. The relics were eventually transferred to Constantinople and then to Milan, from where they were taken to Cologne in 1164 by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa as spoils of his Italian campaigns. The magnificent shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne Cathedral, a golden reliquary completed in the early 13th century, and considered one of the greatest works of medieval goldsmith art, still contains what the faithful believe to be the bones of Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, and Cologne Cathedral itself was built to house this shrine, making it one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval Europe and one of the largest churches in the world, all constructed to honor three figures about whom the biblical text tells us almost nothing, and whose very names derive from legends rather than from any historical record that could be traced back to the actual individuals who visited Jesus in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. The elaborate legendary development that transformed the sparse Matthean account into the rich tradition of the Three Kings illustrates a pattern that appears throughout religious history: the tendency of communities to expand and elaborate upon foundational narratives in ways that make them more detailed, more personally engaging, and more theologically significant than the original accounts that sparked the legendary development. This process is not necessarily dishonest or consciously fabricated, though deliberate fabrication certainly occurred in some cases, but often represents the organic growth of tradition as communities reflect upon sacred stories. Imagine the details that the stories do not provide, and gradually come to treat those imagined details as if they were facts that had always been part of the tradition, rather than later additions that developed over time through processes of imaginative elaboration that are universal in human religious and cultural life. The question for contemporary readers is how to relate to these traditions, how to honor the spiritual and devotional value they have provided to countless generations of believers, while also acknowledging that they cannot claim the authority of the biblical text itself, and that honest engagement with the Bible requires distinguishing between what the text actually says and what tradition has added to what the text says, however beautiful and meaningful those traditional additions might be. The liturgical celebration of the Epiphany, observed on January 6 in Western Christianity, and focus specifically on the visit of the Magi as the revelation of Christ to the Gentile world, has been a major feast since ancient times and remains an important part of the Christian calendar in many traditions. Though it receives less popular attention in contemporary Western culture than Christmas itself, despite being historically at least as significant as December 25th in the Church's celebration of Christ's appearance in the world. The date of January 6th may originally have been the primary celebration of Christ's birth in some early Christian communities before December 25th became standard in the Western Church. And in Eastern Christianity, the Epiphany remains focused on Christ's baptism rather than on the Magi's visit, illustrating how different Christian traditions have developed different emphases in their observance of this feast, even as they share the same biblical sources from which those different emphases derive. The 12 days of Christmas in traditional Western reckoning span the period from December 25 to January 6, connecting the Nativity celebration to the Epiphany celebration, and treating the entire period as an extended festival during which the various aspects of Christ's manifestation to the world are commemorated in sequence, with the Magi's visit serving as climax that reveals the universal significance of the child born in Bethlehem, whose kingship extends beyond Israel to embrace all nations represented by these visitors from distant lands, who recognized what Herod and Jerusalem failed to recognize and who offered worship that the religious establishment of Israel failed to offer to the one who came to fulfill all that Israel had hoped and prayed for through centuries of expectation. The theological significance of the Magi narrative in Matthew's Gospel extends far beyond questions of historical accuracy or legendary development to touch on fundamental themes that shape the entire Gospel and that continue to speak to contemporary readers, regardless of how they resolve the historical questions that the narrative raises. Matthew's Gospel, more than any other Gospel, is concerned with demonstrating that Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy and that his life, death, and resurrection were anticipated in the Hebrew Scriptures in ways that prove his identity as the promised Messiah whom Israel had awaited for centuries. The Magi narrative fits this pattern perfectly, with Matthew explicitly citing the prophecy of Micah about a ruler coming from Bethlehem and implicitly evoking the passages from Psalms and Isaiah about Gentile kings bringing tribute to Israel's messianic king. The Magi serve as proof that Jesus' significance was recognized even by Gentile wise men who studied the stars and discerned in celestial phenomena the announcement of a birth so important that it warranted a long and dangerous journey to pay homage to a child born in obscure circumstances in an insignificant village in a minor province of the Roman Empire. If Persian astrologers could recognize Jesus' importance, how much more should Israel have recognized it, and how shameful that Jerusalem was disturbed rather than overjoyed at the news the Magi brought, that Herod responded with murderous hostility rather than with the worship he hypocritically claimed to intend, that the religious experts who could cite the relevant prophecy accurately enough to direct the Magi to Bethlehem apparently made no effort to go there themselves and to verify whether the Messiah they claimed to await had actually arrived. This contrast between Gentile recognition and Jewish rejection, or at least Jewish indifference, is a theme that runs through Matthew's Gospel and that reaches its culmination in the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel, where the risen Jesus sends his disciples to make disciples of all nations, explicitly extending the mission beyond Israel to the Gentile world that the Magi represent in anticipatory form at the very beginning of the Gospel's narrative. The Magoi are first fruits of the Gentile harvest that Jesus' ministry will ultimately produce, early witnesses to a recognition that will eventually spread throughout the world as the gospel is proclaimed to all nations and as people from every corner of the earth respond to Jesus as the Magoi responded, recognizing his kingship and offering their worship and their gifts in acknowledgement of who he is and what his coming means for them and for all humanity. Read in this light. The Magoi narrative is not merely a touching story about exotic visitors bringing gifts to a special baby, but a theological statement about the universal scope of Jesus' significance and about the unexpected reversals that characterize God's working in the world, where those who should recognize fail to recognize, while those who have no special preparation or expectation somehow perceive what the prepared and expectant cannot see. The wise men were genuinely wise in the most important sense, not because of their scholarly attainments or their professional expertise in celestial interpretation, but because they recognized truth when they encountered it and responded appropriately with worship and generosity, qualities that proved absent in those whose religious knowledge should have prepared them to respond, at least as well as these foreign visitors responded. The gifts the Magoi brought, whatever their original intention may have been, have become in Christian interpretation symbols of what all believers are called to offer to Christ. The gold of our material resources dedicated to his service, the frankincense of our worship and prayer ascending to him as sweet offering, the myrrh of our willingness to share in his suffering and to follow him even to death if faithfulness requires it. This interpretation transforms the historical narrative into paradigm for Christian discipleship, inviting readers to see themselves in the Magoi and to ask what gifts they are bringing to Christ, whether they are undertaking the journey necessary to find him, whether they are willing to persist despite obstacles and dangers and the hostility of powers that would prevent them from reaching their destination, whether they will return home by another way, transformed by their encounter with the one they came to worship, and no longer able to follow the routes that the Herods of the world would have them follow for purposes that serve death rather than life. The journey of the Magoi becomes a template for the spiritual journey that every believer undertakes, a journey guided by light from heaven that may not always be clear or easy to follow. A journey that leads through dangerous territories where hostile powers would prevent us from reaching our goal. A journey that culminates in encounter with Christ, that changes everything and makes impossible any return to the life we lived before that encounter revealed the truth that reorients all our subsequent choices and commitments. The star that guided the Magoi has likewise become symbol of divine guidance in Christian devotional tradition, representing the light that God provides to those who genuinely seek truth and who are willing to follow wherever that light leads, even when the destination is unknown and the path is uncertain. The Magoi did not know exactly where the star would lead them when they set out from their homeland, did not have detailed maps or precise coordinates for their destination, did not know what they would find when they arrived, or what reception they would receive from the local authorities, or what the ultimate outcome of their journey would be. They knew only that something significant had happened, that heaven had announced the birth of a king worthy of their homage, and that they were compelled by their own integrity as seekers of truth to follow the sign they had been given and to discover for themselves what it meant and who it announced. This combination of partial knowledge and faithful response is paradigmatic for all spiritual seeking, which never proceeds with complete information or guaranteed outcomes, but always requires the courage to act on what we know while remaining open to learning more as our journey unfolds, and as new light reveals dimensions of reality that we could not have perceived from our starting point, but that become visible as we move forward in faith toward destinations that clarify only as we approach them. The Magi trusted the star enough to follow it, and their trust was rewarded with an encounter that vindicated their journey and that has made their names, whatever their actual names may have been, immortal in the memory of billions who have heard their story and who have found in it inspiration for their own journeys toward the Christ, whom the Magi were privileged to meet in person, and whom subsequent generations meet through faith that is no less real for being mediated through scripture and tradition rather than through direct physical presence. The fact that the Magi were Gentiles, outsiders to the covenant community of Israel, practitioners of arts that the Hebrew scriptures sometimes condemn as forbidden divination, makes their presence in the infancy narrative all the more striking and all the more theologically significant. God did not limit the announcement of Christ's birth to those within the covenant, did not restrict the invitation to worship to those whose religious practice conformed to the standards of Israelite orthodoxy, did not require the Magi to convert to Judaism or to abandon their astrological expertise before they could be guided to the Christ child and welcomed into his presence. They came as they were, with the knowledge and the methods they had developed within their own cultural and religious context, and those methods proved sufficient to lead them to truth that transcended the limitations of their original framework, even as it validated their sincere seeking within that framework. This is radical inclusivity that challenges any religious exclusivism that would deny the possibility of God working through unexpected people and unexpected means to accomplish divine purposes that exceed human categories of who is in and who is out, who is acceptable and who is not, who can be a vessel of divine purpose and who is disqualified by characteristics that human judgment considers incompatible with genuine spiritual attainment or authentic religious practice. The Magi narrative thus stands at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel as announcement of themes that the Gospel will develop throughout its narrative, and that reach their fulfillment in the Great Commission, where all nations are included in the scope of Christ's redemptive mission. The child whom the Magi worshipped will grow to become the teacher, who proclaimed that many will come from east and west to take their places at the feast in the kingdom of heaven, while the subjects of the kingdom are thrown outside, a direct inversion of expectations that privileged insiders discover themselves excluded, while outsiders they despised find themselves welcomed. The Magi prefigure this inversion. These Gentile stargazers who perceived what the Jewish religious establishment failed to perceive, and who responded with worship that put to shame the indifference of those whose entire religious tradition should have prepared them to recognize and welcome what the Magi recognized and welcomed without any such preparation. The scandal of the gospel is already present in this infancy narrative. The scandal of grace that refuses to follow human rules about who deserves what and who should be first and who should be last. Grace that elevates the humble and humbles the elevated, that invites in those who were far off, while those who were near find themselves surprisingly outside looking in because they assumed their nearness guaranteed their inclusion and never actually responded to the invitation their nearness should have made them most eager to accept. The implications of recovering the factual core of the Magi narrative from the traditional accretions that have obscured it extend far beyond this particular story to raise fundamental questions about how we read biblical texts, how we distinguish between what Scripture actually says and what tradition has taught us Scripture says, and how we maintain intellectual honesty in our engagement with sacred texts, while also honoring the spiritual value of traditions that have nourished countless generations of believers, even when those traditions cannot claim strict biblical warrant for all their details. The discovery that much of what we thought we knew about the wise men derives from post-biblical tradition rather than from the biblical text itself can be disorienting for believers who have always assumed that the familiar details of the Christmas story came directly from Scripture, and who may feel that acknowledging the legendary character of those details somehow diminishes the authority or the meaning of the biblical narrative that underlies them. But honest engagement with the Bible requires precisely this willingness to distinguish between the text and its interpretations, between the original sources and the traditions that have grown up around them, between what we can know with confidence based on the evidence available to us and what we have assumed we knew based on repetition of claims that turn out to be less well-founded than we believed when we accepted them uncritically as part of the religious formation we received from communities that transmitted those claims without always being aware of their origins or their relationship to the actual biblical texts they were supposedly based upon. The process of disentangling the biblical text from its traditional interpretations is not destructive of faith, but can actually be constructive of deeper and more authentic faith that is grounded in what the text actually reveals, rather than in human additions that may or may not accurately reflect the realities the text describes. When we recognize that the Bible does not tell us how many Magoi there were, we are freed from the assumption that there were exactly 3, and can read the text with fresh eyes that notice details we might have overlooked when we thought we already knew what the text said, and therefore did not read it carefully enough to discover what it actually says. When we recognize that the Bible does not call the Magoi kings, we can engage more seriously with what they actually were. Persian religious specialists whose expertise in celestial interpretation led them to recognize the significance of a phenomenon that others might have dismissed as merely curious or unusual, and we can reflect on what it means that God used people with this particular background and these particular skills to be among the first to recognize and worship the Christ child. When we recognize that the Bible does not place the Magoi at the manger alongside the shepherds on the night of Jesus' birth, we can appreciate the distinctive contribution each gospel makes to our understanding of Jesus' significance. Matthew's focus on the recognition Jesus received from Gentile seekers who traveled great distances to find him, contrasting with Luke's focus on the recognition Jesus received from humble Jewish shepherds who were nearby and who responded immediately to the angelic announcement they received. These are different emphases, telling different aspects of the same fundamental story, and conflating them into a single composite image loses the distinctive theological contribution each gospel makes, while creating a scene that neither gospel actually describes. The recovery of the factual biblical narrative also invites us to sit with the mystery that the biblical text preserves, rather than resolving that mystery through legendary additions that provide the specific details the text declines to provide. We do not know how many Magoi there were, and that not knowing is itself significant, inviting us to reflect on why Matthew did not consider this information important enough to include, and what it might mean that generations of readers have felt compelled to supply what Matthew did not supply. We do not know the Magoi's names, and that anonymity is itself significant, suggesting that their individual identities matter less than their representative function as Gentile seekers who recognized what Israel's own leaders failed to recognize. We do not know exactly what the star was or how it behaved, and that uncertainty is itself significant, preserving the sense of wonder and mystery that the Magoi themselves must have felt as they followed a phenomenon they could not fully explain toward a destination they could not precisely identify until they arrived and discovered what they had been seeking. The legendary traditions that supply names, numbers, and detailed backstories for the Magoi resolve these mysteries in ways that may satisfy curiosity, but that also close down the productive uncertainty that the biblical text maintains, and that invites readers into ongoing reflection, rather than providing final answers that end reflection by seeming to tell us everything we might want to know. This does not mean that the legendary traditions are worthless, or that Christians should abandon them entirely in favor of a stripped-down reading that refuses to go beyond what the biblical text explicitly states. Traditions develop for reasons, and the reasons are often spiritually and theologically significant, even when the specific content of the traditions cannot claim historical accuracy. The tradition that the three kings represent the three continents known to the medieval world, making their homage to Christ a symbolic recognition from all of humanity, captures a genuine theological truth about the universal significance of Christ's birth, even if that truth is not what the historical Magi themselves intended to communicate. And even if the tradition significantly transforms who they were and what they did in service of a theological point that the original narrative did not explicitly make. The tradition that the gifts symbolize Christ's kingship, divinity, and mortality captures genuine theological truths about who Jesus is and what his mission would involve, even if the Magi themselves intended their gifts simply as appropriate offerings for a royal birth without the specific symbolic meanings later interpretation has assigned to them. The traditions are not wrong in what they affirm theologically, only in what they claim historically, and distinguishing between these two kinds of claims allows us to appreciate the traditions for what they genuinely offer, while also maintaining the intellectual honesty that refuses to claim historical knowledge we do not actually possess. The broader lesson here concerns the nature of biblical authority and the proper way to honor that authority in our reading and interpretation of biblical texts. Biblical authority is not served by attributing to the Bible claims it does not make, details it does not provide, or teachings it does not contain. When we treat legendary editions as if they were biblical facts, we actually undermine biblical authority by making the Bible responsible for claims it never made, and that may or may not be true, claims that can be challenged by evidence the Bible itself does not provide, and that will reflect badly on the Bible's reliability when they are shown to be unsupported by the biblical text to which they have been incorrectly attributed. The prosperity preacher who claims biblical support for teachings the Bible does not support, the political advocate who claims biblical warrant for positions the Bible does not address, the traditionalist who claims that customs developed centuries after biblical times are mandated by biblical authority. All of these misuses of the Bible share the common error of attributing to the Bible content that does not derive from the Bible, and that cannot claim the authority the Bible possesses for what it actually teaches. The same error operates in a milder form when we assume the traditional details of biblical stories are biblically warranted when they actually derive from post-biblical tradition, and correcting this error in the case of the Magi narrative can alert us to the same error operating in countless other cases where we have assumed we knew what the Bible said without actually reading the Bible carefully enough to discover what it says and what it does not say. The discipline of reading the Bible carefully, attending to what it actually states rather than what we have been told it states, distinguishing between the text and interpretations of the text is fundamental to serious engagement with Scripture and is a discipline that benefits from practice and from the kind of critical examination that this investigation of the Magi narrative has modeled. When we approach the Bible assuming we already know what it says, we tend to find confirmation of what we already believe rather than discovery of what the text might teach us if we approached it with genuine openness to learning something we did not already know. The traditional image of the three kings at the manger is so firmly fixed in our minds that we can read Matthew's account of the Magi and see three kings at the manger, even though Matthew mentions neither three nor kings nor manger. Our mental image so powerful that it overrides the actual words on the page and prevents us from noticing that those words do not say what we assumed they said. This is a general problem in reading, not specific to biblical interpretation, but it is particularly acute in biblical interpretation because we typically encounter biblical texts in contexts where they have already been interpreted for us, where teachers and preachers and artistic representations have already told us what the texts mean and shown us what the texts describe, making it very difficult to approach the texts with the fresh eyes that might notice things the traditional interpretations have overlooked or gotten wrong. The factual story of the wise men, stripped of the traditional additions that have transformed it into something quite different from what Matthew originally wrote, is both simpler and more mysterious than the traditional version, less detailed but more open to wonder, less certain in its specifics, but more inviting of reflection and imagination, that the traditional version forecloses by seeming to answer questions that the biblical text leaves deliberately open. Matthew tells us that Magi from the East, practitioners of Persian religious arts including celestial interpretation, observed a phenomenon they understood as announcing the birth of a king of the Jews and traveled to Jerusalem to find this king and offer him homage. Matthew tells us that Herod and all Jerusalem were disturbed by this news, that Herod consulted religious experts who identified Bethlehem as the prophesied birthplace of the Messiah, that Herod directed the Magi to Bethlehem and asked them to report back to him so that he too could worship the newborn king, intending actually to kill him as potential rival to his throne. Matthew tells us that the star the Magi had seen reappeared and led them to the specific location where the child was, that they found him in a house with his mother Mary, that they worshipped him and presented gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and that they returned to their homeland by a different route after being warned in a dream not to report to Herod. This is what Matthew tells us, and this is what we can claim to know about the Magi, based on the only biblical source that mentions them. Everything else, the number 3, the names Caspar and Melchior and Balthazar, the royal status, the camels, the presence at the manger alongside shepherds on the night of Jesus' birth, the representation of 3 continents or 3 ages of man, the elaborate legends about their subsequent lives and deaths, and the discovery of their relics by Helena, and the construction of magnificent shrines to house their bones. All of this is tradition that has grown up around the biblical text, but that cannot claim the authority of that text for its specific claims. This tradition is not thereby worthless, and much of it is beautiful and spiritually meaningful and has enriched Christian devotion for centuries in ways that have genuine value regardless of the historical accuracy of the traditional details. But the tradition is not the Bible, and honoring the Bible's authority requires distinguishing between what the Bible says and what tradition has added to what the Bible says, even when the traditional additions have become so familiar that they feel like biblical truth, and even when acknowledging their non-biblical origin feels like loss of something precious that we have cherished since childhood and that we have passed on to our own children as part of the religious heritage we received and that we want to transmit to future generations. The transmission of religious heritage involves difficult decisions about what to pass on and how to pass it on. Decisions that become more complex when we recognize that the heritage we received included elements of varying origin and varying reliability that were not always clearly distinguished by those who transmitted them to us, and that we may not have distinguished clearly in our own transmission to those who received the heritage from us. Do we continue to display nativity scenes that place the wise men at the manger, even though we now know the Bible does not support this placement? Do we continue to speak of 3 kings, even though we now know the Bible does not specify their number or call them kings? Do we teach our children the names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, even though we now know these names have no biblical basis and first appear in sources written centuries after the events they supposedly describe? There are no easy answers to these questions, and different communities and different families will reasonably reach different conclusions based on their assessment of the relative importance of various values that may pull in different directions. The value of historical accuracy, the value of continuity with tradition, the value of beauty and meaning that the traditional representations provide, the value of intellectual honesty that refuses to claim knowledge we do not possess, the value of simplicity in religious education that does not burden children with complexities they are not ready to navigate. What seems clear is that awareness of the distinction between the biblical text and traditional elaborations of that text is valuable regardless of what practical decisions we make about how to navigate that distinction in our religious practice and our transmission of religious heritage. Knowing that the three kings are traditional rather than biblical allows us to appreciate them as tradition rather than mistaking them for biblical revelation, to value them for what they genuinely offer while not investing them with authority they do not possess, to hold them more lightly than we would hold claims that derive from Scripture itself and that carry the weight of biblical authority that tradition cannot claim. This knowledge also prepares us to engage more critically and more honestly with other traditional claims that we may have mistaken for biblical claims, alerting us to the general phenomenon of traditional elaboration of biblical narratives and equipping us to investigate other cases where similar elaboration may have occurred and where similar distinctions between text and tradition may need to be drawn. The Manger narrative thus serves as case study in critical biblical reading, a worked example that models the kind of careful attention to what texts actually say that we should bring to all our biblical reading if we want to understand what the Bible actually teaches, rather than what we have been told it teaches by traditions that may or may not faithfully represent biblical content. The ultimate value of the Manger narrative, whether in its spare biblical form or in its elaborate traditional form, lies in its witness to the recognition that Jesus received from unexpected quarters, and in its invitation to readers to consider their own response to the one the Manger traveled so far to worship. The Manger saw something in the heavens that they interpreted as significant, and they acted on that interpretation by undertaking a difficult journey to discover for themselves what the celestial sign announced. They did not know exactly what they would find or exactly where they would find it, but they knew that whatever it was deserved their attention and their homage, and they were willing to expend considerable effort and take considerable risks to offer that homage to whoever or whatever awaited them at their journey's end. This is the posture of genuine seeking, the willingness to act on partial knowledge in pursuit of truth that cannot be fully known until it is encountered, the faith that undertakes journeys without complete maps, because the destination is important enough to seek, even when the path is uncertain and the outcome is unknown. The Manger model this seeking, and their story invites us to consider whether we are willing to seek with similar dedication, to journey with similar persistence, to worship with similar generosity when we find what we have been seeking, and to depart by different routes than we came, because the encounter has changed us and made impossible any simple return to the lives we lived before we found what we did not know we were looking for, until we found it and discovered that it was what we had always needed and what we could never again live without. The Christ child whom the Manger worshipped did not need their gifts, did not depend on their recognition for his identity or his mission, did not require their homage to validate who he was or what he had come to do. He received their worship as he receives all worship, as free offering that honors the giver as much as the recipient, as expression of the giver's recognition of truth that enriches the giver through the act of acknowledgement, more than it adds anything to the one acknowledged. The Manger left richer than they came, not because they had received anything material from the encounter, but because they had given what they came to give, and had thereby fulfilled the purpose that had drawn them across vast distances to this improbable destination where the King of the universe lay in the arms of a peasant mother in an ordinary house in an obscure village that no one would have noticed except for what happened there. And except for the witnesses who recognized what happened and who preserved the memory of their recognition for all subsequent generations, who would hear their story and find in it inspiration for their own journeys toward the Christ, who still awaits all who seek him, who still receives all who come to him, who still transforms all who encounter him and worship him and offer him whatever gifts they have to give, which are always enough when given with the sincerity and the devotion that the Magi exemplified, and that remains the model for all who would follow in their footsteps across whatever distances separate us from the one we seek, and who seeks us even more than we seek him. This is the factual story of the wise men. No thrones, no trio, no manger, but seekers who sought and found and worshipped and departed, changed by what they had encountered. The traditional elaborations add color and specificity and emotional resonance that the spare biblical narrative does not provide. And those elaborations have their own value that need not be denied in acknowledging their non-biblical origin. But the factual story, the story Matthew actually tells, has its own power and its own beauty and its own invitation that does not depend on the traditional additions, and that speaks directly to readers who approach it with openness to what it actually says, rather than with expectations shaped by what they have been told it says. May we have the courage to read this story and all biblical stories with the same care and the same openness, discovering what the texts actually reveal rather than confirming what we assumed before we read them. And may what we discover draw us into the same journey of seeking and finding and worshipping that the Magi undertook so long ago. And that remains the paradigm for all genuine spiritual seeking in every age and every place where human hearts are restless until they rest in the one whom the Magi found and whom we too can find if we are willing to follow whatever stars are given to us as guides, toward the destination that awaits all who seek with sincerity and persistence the truth that sets us free.